There was a row of stools bolted to the floor, red vinyl cracked from 40 years of work coats sliding on and off. The counter was formica, cool under your forearms. Behind it, a griddle that never fully cooled, not from 7 in the morning until the doors locked at 6. This was the Woolworth's lunch counter. Every town had one. For 60 cents, you sat down next to the bank teller, the farmer, the kids skipping last period, and ate a real meal off a real plate. It wasn't a restaurant, it was a clock. Then, quietly, it stopped. Here are 25 things they served there. Number 25. Number 25. Grilled cheese sandwich, 2 slices of soft white bread on a griddle slicked with real butter. Cut straight off the stick, not margarine, not spray. 1 slice of American cheese between them, pressed flat with a spatula. You could hear it, that low hiss as butter met bread, the edges going gold, then deeper gold, then exactly right, 15 cents, 1955. Add tomato soup for a dime, and a quarter bought lunch with a nickel left over for bubble gum. This was not a snack. This was the meal, and it was enough. Now it's artisanal grilled cheese. Fig jam smeared on top, $11. Same bread, same cheese. Different price entirely. Number 24. Egg salad sandwich, hard-boiled eggs, peeled while still warm, chopped rough with a fork. Never smooth, never a paste. You wanted to see the yolk in little yellow crumbles against the white. A spoonful of mayonnaise, a pinch of mustard powder, salt, maybe a sprinkle of paprika on top for color. Spread thick between 2 slices of bread, crusts left on, 20 cents, most counters, through the 1950s. Eggs were the cheapest complete protein on the shelf. By 1958, a dozen ran about 60 cents, which meant 6 eggs and a little bread fed 3 or 4 people lunch for under a quarter each. Grandma just called it Tuesday, number 23. Coney style. Grilled Frank's Detroit gets the credit, though by the late 1950s, you could find it from Toledo to Flint to Chicago. A hot dog split down the middle, laid cut side down on the griddle until it blistered and curled at the ends. Steamed bun, a spoonful of loose beef chili, no beans, ever, a stripe of yellow mustard, and a fistful of raw chopped onion, sharp enough to sting your eyes before the first bite, 15 to 20 cents, depending on the year. The smell of that griddle, onion, beef fat, mustard, the slight char of the casing, hit you before you even saw the counter. Number 22. BLT on toast bacon, fried slow until it curled and the fat ran clear at the edges. Real toast scorched slightly at the corners if nobody was watching. Iceberg lettuce, cold from the walk-in, with that wet crunch. A thick slab of tomato, the kind that only existed for 6 weeks in late summer, when it actually tasted like something 40 cents, into the 1960s. The bacon grease soaked straight through the toast in the first minute, turning the bottom slice translucent and somehow better for it. This is one of the only things on this list you can still get close to right, if you can find bacon that isn't pumped full of water. Number 21. Vegetable beef soup. This was the soup of the day more often than not, and it was never made on purpose. It was made from what was left. A beef bone with meat still clinging to it, simmered for hours until the marrow gave up everything. Carrots, potatoes, a can of tomatoes, whatever was wilting in the walk-in by Thursday. Salt, pepper, and thyme, 15 to 20 cents a bowl, with a couple of saltines on the side, free, nothing wasted. That was the entire philosophy. The bone another kitchen would have thrown away became the base of a soup that fed 100 people, and every one of them left full. Number 20. Chicken salad sandwich, diced chicken. Usually the dark meat, because it was cheaper and frankly had more flavor. Folded into mayonnaise with celery for crunch, sometimes a few grapes or a sprinkle of slivered almonds on the counters that wanted to feel a little uptown. Served on white bread, sometimes toasted, sometimes not, cut into triangles if the counter was trying to impress anybody, cut straight across if it wasn't. 30 cents most places through the 1950s, Today you'll find this same sandwich, same chicken, same mayonnaise, same celery on a chalkboard menu for $14, described as house-made chicken salad on artisan bread. The only thing artisan about it in 1955 was that an actual person made it by hand that morning in the back of a 5 and dime, number 19. Tuna melt canned tuna, drained and flaked, mixed with mayonnaise and a little chopped onion or pickle for bite, piled onto a slice of bread, topped with a slice of cheese, and run under the broiler, or, on counters without one, pressed on the griddle under a metal weight until the cheese went brown and bubbled at the edges, and the tuna underneath turned warm and almost custardy. 35 cents into the 1960s. The smell of it, hot tuna, melted cheese, toasted bread, was a smell that meant lunch was almost ready, and it traveled the length of the counter before the plate did. It's a strange thing to mourn a tuna sandwich, but the texture of that cheese, broiled properly, with the tuna gone soft and warm underneath, that's not something you get from a microwave. That's a piece of equipment they took out of the kitchen on purpose, because broilers are slower than microwaves, and slower doesn't scale, number 18. Triple-decker club sandwich 3 slices of toast, 2 layers of filling, turkey or chicken on the bottom, bacon, lettuce, and tomato on top, with mayonnaise on every single slice, because a dry club sandwich is an insult. The whole thing held together with toothpicks, usually with little frilled cellophane tops on them, and cut into quarters on the diagonal so it looked like more food than it was, even though it usually was more food than anything else on the menu. 55 cents through the late 1950s and into the 60s. Genuinely expensive for a lunch counter, the kind of thing you ordered on a birthday, or when your dad got a raise, or just because. You ate it in a particular order, too. You pulled the toothpicks out first, lined them up on the edge of the plate, and then you picked a quarter and ate it whole, because trying to eat a club sandwich in bites was how you ended up wearing half of it. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know about that lunch counter plate. Whatever it was, the meatloaf, the turkey, the soup, and the sandwich together, it was balanced. Not by accident, and not because anybody at Woolworth's had a degree in nutrition. It was balanced because that's what a full meal looked like to the people cooking it. A protein, a starch, something green or orange, and enough fat to carry the flavor and keep you from being hungry again in an hour. The federal government had spent the early 1940s drilling that exact structure into the public, plate by plate, because a country that was about to ship millions of young men overseas needed everybody else fed properly on whatever was left. By the time that generation was running the lunch counters of the 1950s, the structure wasn't a guideline anymore. It was just how you made a plate. Compare that to what passes for a fast meal now. A sandwich that's mostly bun, a side that's mostly oil, and a drink that's mostly corn syrup engineered in a lab to make you want another one in 2 hours. That's not a meal. That's a product designed to be eaten again. They knew things about feeding people on 20 cents a plate that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. Mostly because we're going to have to relearn it the hard way on the other side of a chronic disease epidemic that didn't exist when the lunch counter was still open. Number 17. Pimento cheese sandwich sharp cheddar, grated by hand on the side of a box grater, mixed with mayonnaise and a jar of diced pimentos until it turned that particular shade of orange pink that exists nowhere else in food. Some cooks added a dash of cayenne, a little grated onion, a pinch of sugar to round it out. Spread thick on white bread, sometimes toasted on the griddle until the cheese inside went soft and the bread got a little crunch. This was a Southern counter staple. Atlanta, Charlotte, Birmingham, Nashville, 25 cents through the 1950s. and it was the kind of thing every family had its own version of, with its own ratio of mayonnaise to cheese that nobody would ever write down because everybody already knew it. Now it's Southern pimento cheese, served on a little wooden board with crackers, $9 at restaurants 3 states north of where it was actually invented. They took Grandma's leftover cheese trick and put it on a charcuterie board, number 16. Welsh rarebit, this one, belonged to the department store tea rooms more than the dime store counters at first. New York, Philadelphia, the bigger Woolworth's locations with a little more ambition in their kitchens. But by the 1950s, it had spread to lunch counters across the Northeast. A thick, sharp sauce made from grated cheddar, melted slowly with a little beer or milk, a dash of mustard powder, a few drops of Worcestershire, poured hot and bubbling over a slice of toast, 35 to 45 cents. The sauce had a smell to it, sharp, slightly sour from the beer, with that mustard tang underneath, and it arrived at the table still moving, still settling into the toast underneath it. It sounds strange now. Cheese sauce over bread, called by a name that confuses everybody who hears it for the first time. But it was warm, and it was rich, and on a cold day in a city where the wind came straight off the river, it was exactly what a person needed at lunchtime for less than half a dollar. Number 15. Creamed chicken a la king on toast leftover chicken from Sunday's roast more often than not, pulled into bite-sized pieces and folded into a cream sauce with mushrooms, a little diced pimento for color, sometimes a splash of sherry if the counter had any on hand. Spooned generously over a slice of toast, or two, until the toast went soft underneath and the sauce pooled at the edges of the plate, around 50 cents, which made it one of the pricier items on the counter. But it was built almost entirely from what would otherwise have been thrown away. The chicken that didn't get eaten Sunday became Monday's lunch special, dressed up just enough to feel like its own dish. This was not leftovers. This was a second meal, made from the bones of the first one, and nobody at that counter knew or cared that what they were eating had been a roast chicken 2 days before. That's not a trick. That's just what cooking used to mean. Number 14. Liver and onions beef liver, sliced thin, dredged in flour, fried quick on the griddle so the outside went crisp, while the inside stayed soft and dark red at the center. A pile of onions, sliced thick, cooked slow in the same pan until they went sweet and brown and nearly collapsed. Served together, with mashed potatoes and gravy on the side, 45 to 55 cents nationwide, and it was one of the cheapest cuts of meat a counter could put on a plate. Liver cost a fraction of what a steak did, sometimes given away nearly free by butchers who couldn't sell it otherwise. Here's the part the food industry would really rather you didn't think about. The cheap, unwanted cut was, and is, one of the most nutrient-dense foods that exists. Iron, B12, vitamin A, all in concentrations that a piece of steak doesn't come close to. Grandma served it because it was cheap. It happened to also be one of the healthiest things on the menu. She didn't need a label to tell her that. She just knew that after a plate of liver and onions, you didn't feel tired in the way you did after other meals. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 13. Meatloaf plate ground beef. Sometimes stretched with ground pork, sometimes with breadcrumbs or even crushed crackers soaked in milk, mixed with onion, egg, salt, pepper, and a stripe of ketchup or tomato sauce across the top before it went into the oven. Sliced thick, served with mashed potatoes and a vegetable, all under a ladle of brown gravy that touched everything on the plate, whether you wanted it to or not, 55 to 65 cents, and a single loaf, maybe a pound and a half of meat, stretched with everything else, could portion out for a dozen plates over a lunch shift. This was not a meat dish. This was an engineering project, built to take the smallest possible amount of the most expensive ingredient and turn it into the largest possible number of full plates. And it worked so well that for decades, Nobody even thought of it as cheap food. They just thought of it as Tuesday's special, the thing their mother made, the smell that meant they were home. Number 12. Macaroni and cheese plate elbow macaroni, boiled soft, folded into a sauce made from real cheddar, melted into a roux of butter, flour, and milk, thick enough to coat the back of a spoon, sharp enough that you could smell it from 3 stools down, baked in a pan until the top went golden and slightly crisp, then cut into squares and served as a plate on its own, sometimes with a few stewed tomatoes on the side for color and acid. 30 to 35 cents through the 1950s and into the 60s, a meal that cost almost nothing and filled a person up for the rest of the afternoon. Now it's elevated mac and cheese, $16, with truffle oil drizzled over the top and a name on the menu that sounds like it belongs in a museum. They didn't elevate anything. They took the same pan of cheese sauce and noodles that fed a family of 5 for under a quarter, and they charged 60 times that for a portion a third of the size. Number 11. Hot turkey sandwich, open-faced a slice of bread, laid flat on a plate, covered with sliced turkey. Real turkey, roasted that morning or the night before, not pressed or formed, then a generous scoop of mashed potatoes alongside, and the entire plate flooded with gravy, thick and brown, until the bread underneath went soft and the edges of the potatoes started to disappear into it. 60 to 65 cents, nationwide through the 1950s. It was essentially a small Thanksgiving dinner, available on a Tuesday for less than $1, with a fork and a paper napkin. This was not a sandwich. This was a holiday, served on a weekday, to anybody who walked in off the street with 65 cents in their pocket. Nobody questioned why turkey and gravy and mashed potatoes were on the menu in March. It was just food, and it was good, and it was there every single day if you wanted it. Number 10. Friday fish sandwich, a fillet of whitefish, haddock, cod, whatever came in fresh that week, dipped in batter and fried until the outside went crisp and pale gold, served on a bun with a slice of cheese melted on top and a swipe of tartar sauce. 30 cents in Catholic working-class neighborhoods across the Northeast and Midwest. Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Buffalo, Boston, where Friday meant no meat, and the lunch counter knew it. The Friday fish sandwich wasn't a special. It was an institution as reliable as the church bells, and the counter would sell hundreds of them in a single lunch shift. Every single Friday, for decades, you knew it was Friday before you even looked at a calendar. You knew by the smell coming from 3 blocks away. Number 9. Western sandwich diced ham, green pepper, and onion scrambled together with eggs right on the griddle until it set into something between an omelet and a scramble, then folded between 2 slices of toast or, on some counters, served open-faced on a single slice with the egg mixture piled on top, 35 to 40 cents, found from the Midwest out toward the West Coast. A breakfast item that, on a lunch counter, didn't respect the clock. You could order it at 11 in the morning or 2 in the afternoon, and nobody blinked because the griddle was always hot and the eggs were always there. It was loud on the griddle, the hiss of the peppers and onions hitting hot fat, the scrape of the spatula folding everything together, and it smelled like a diner kitchen at 6 in the morning, no matter what time it actually was. Now here's the part of the story nobody puts in the nostalgia videos. The lunch counter didn't disappear because people stopped wanting it. It disappeared because somebody decided it wasn't profitable enough. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, fast food chains expanded at a pace the old 5 and dime counters simply couldn't match. Faster service, lower labor costs, a model built entirely around turning tables in minutes, instead of letting a person sit at a counter for half an hour with a cup of coffee that got refilled for free. F.W. Woolworth Company watched its food service divisions become the least profitable square footage in every store it owned, compared to retail shelving that didn't need a cook, a dishwasher, or a waitress. So, store by store, through the 1970s and into the 1980s, the lunch counters started coming out. Not all at once, quietly, a few stores a year, until one day a town would realize its Woolworths didn't have a counter anymore, and nobody could quite remember when it had stopped. By 1997, the very last Woolworths store in the United States closed its doors for good. The company that had fed entire towns for less than $1 a plate for nearly a century became a sporting goods retailer, and the building that once smelled like coffee and griddle grease became a shoe store. That is not progress. That is the deliberate removal of the only place in town where everybody, rich, poor, old, young, sat down at the same counter and ate the same food off the same plates. Number 8. Patty Melt, a thin beef patty, griddled hard and fast until the edges went dark and crisp, topped with a slice of Swiss or American cheese and a pile of onions that had been cooking slow in butter the whole time, going soft and sweet and almost translucent. The whole thing pressed between 2 slices of rye bread that had been buttered and griddled themselves, so every surface of the sandwich had some contact with hot fat. 45 cents. Midwest diner counters through the 1950s, and the smell of those onions cooking low and slow for 20 minutes before the patty ever hit the griddle was the smell that told you the patty melt was on the menu that day before you even sat down. Today it's a smash burger melt, $14 to $16, served with a side of fries that cost more than the entire original sandwich did, adjusted for inflation or not. Number 7. Chili and crackers, a thick bowl of chili, ground beef, kidney beans, or no beans, depending on which part of the country you were in, tomatoes, chili powder, cumin, simmered low for hours until it had reduced down to something closer to a stew than a soup, served with a sleeve of saltine crackers, crumpled in or eaten on the side, and sometimes a sprinkle of shredded cheese or chopped raw onion on top if the counter was feeling generous. 25 cents, Midwest and nationwide, late 1950s into the 60s. It was the kind of thing that warmed you from the inside on a cold day, the steam rising off the bowl, fogging up your glasses if you leaned over it too fast. There was nothing complicated about it. It was meat and beans and spice, cooked a long time, and it cost $0.25, and it was enough. Number 6. Lime Ricky at the soda fountain end of the counter, the cook or the jerk, which is what they were actually called, and nobody thought twice about it, would pull a glass, squeeze fresh lime juice into the bottom, add a pump or two of simple syrup from a hand-cranked dispenser, then fill the rest with carbonated water straight from the fountain tap, stirring it once with a long spoon so the lime settled through instead of sitting on top. 5 cents nationwide through the 1950s. The carbonation was made fresh, right there, from a tank under the counter, not from a bottle, not from a can, and it had a bite to it that bottled soda never quite manages. A sharper fizz that faded faster but hit harder. This was not a soft drink. This was a drink made by a person, in front of you in about 15 seconds for a nickel. Number 5. Cherry Coke, same fountain, same carbonated water, but this time the cook pulled the cola syrup lever first, a long pour, dark and thick, then added a shot of cherry syrup from a separate pump and topped it off with the fizzing water, the whole thing turning a deep red brown as it filled the glass. 5 cents. Same era, same counters. The 2 syrups never came pre-mixed. That was the whole point. You watched it get made, 1 pump at a time, and you could ask for more cherry, and the jerk would just nod and give you another pump. No extra charge, because why would there be? Now it comes in a can, pre-mixed at a factory somewhere you'll never see, and it costs more than the nickel did even before you adjust for inflation. And nobody asks you how much cherry you want, because the answer was decided for you years ago by somebody with a spreadsheet. Number 4. Malted milk, shake ice cream, milk, and a few spoonfuls of malted milk powder. The dry, slightly nutty powder that came in a tin and turned an ordinary milkshake into something denser, deeper, with a flavor almost like toasted bread underneath the sweetness. Blended in a metal cup on a machine that rattled the whole counter while it ran, then poured, most of it, into a tall glass, with the extra left in the metal cup beside it, because a proper malt always made more than the glass could hold. 15 to 20 cents nationwide through the 1950s. It was thick enough that the straw would stand up on its own in the glass, and you had to work for every sip, which was part of the appeal. Nothing that good should come easy. Number 3. Hot fudge sundae 2 scoops of vanilla ice cream in a glass dish. Then hot fudge, actually hot, made from real chocolate, melted with cream and a little butter, kept warm in a double boiler behind the counter, poured over the top until it pooled around the ice cream, and started immediately to melt the edges of each scoop. A spoonful of whipped cream on top, a maraschino cherry, sometimes a sprinkle of chopped nuts if the counter stocked them. 20 cents nationwide through the 1950s. The contrast was the whole point. Cold ice cream, hot fudge, the two working against each other in the same bite, the fudge going slightly firm where it touched the cold scoop and staying liquid everywhere else. Now it's an artisan sundae, $8 or $9, and half the time the fudge isn't even hot. It's room temperature chocolate sauce from a squeeze bottle, because keeping a double boiler running behind the counter all day costs labor, and labor is the first thing they cut. Number 2. Apple pie a la mode slice of pie. Apples cooked down soft inside a crust that had been made that morning, rolled by hand, with the edges crimped by someone's thumb and forefinger. No two pies exactly alike, because no two cooks crimped a crust the same way. Served warm, with a scoop of vanilla ice cream set right on top, so that by the time it reached you, the ice cream had already started to melt into the warm filling underneath. 15 to 20 cents nationwide through the 1950s. The temperature contrast again, warm pie, cold ice cream, melting into each other, was not an accident. It was the entire reason the dish existed in that combination. Number 1. Banana split a whole banana, split lengthwise and laid along both sides of a long glass dish. 3 scoops of ice cream, usually vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry, set in a row between the banana halves. Then the toppings: chocolate syrup over the chocolate scoop, strawberry sauce over the strawberry, pineapple over the vanilla, each one matched to its own scoop on purpose. Whipped cream over everything, a cherry on each mound, and sometimes a sprinkle of chopped peanuts across the whole thing. 35 cents, late 1950s into the 60s, and it was not an everyday order. It was the thing you got when something good happened. A good report card, a birthday, the end of a long week of chores, when your father reached into his pocket and said, "Go on, get yourself something." Grandma just called it a treat, and she was right too. Not everything has to be earned through frugality alone. Sometimes the whole point of having 35 cents is spending it on something with 3 flavors of ice cream and a cherry on top, and feeling, for 10 minutes, like the luckiest kid at the counter. She was right. Everything she knew was right, closing 25 plates. 25 things a person could order, sit down and eat, slowly, at a counter, next to a stranger who might become a friend by the time the check came. Fry up that patty, melt the way it was meant to be. Onions cooked slow, 20 minutes, before the beef ever touches the pan. Build that club sandwich the right way. Toothpicks, frills, cut on the diagonal, every slice of bread carrying its share of mayonnaise. Pour that cherry Coke 1 pump at a time, and taste the difference between a drink someone made for you and a drink that was made for you weeks ago in a factory. These women, the ones behind those counters, the ones who fed entire towns on quarters and dimes, who stretched a chicken into 2 meals and turned a beef bone into a soup that fed 100 people. They were not doing something quaint. They were doing something difficult, and they were doing it every single day, and they did it so well that we mistook it for simple. We didn't lose the lunch counter because the food stopped being good. We lost it because somebody calculated, in a boardroom, that a shoe display made more money per square foot than a griddle did, and they were right, and that is exactly the problem. That is not progress. That is the deliberate dismantling of the one place in every town where everyone, regardless of what they had in their pocket, sat down at the same counter and ate the same food off the same plates. Tray one this week. Just one. Doesn't matter which comment below, and tell me which one your grandmother made. Number 7. Ramps. Wild onions fried with eggs by March, after months of cornmeal, beans, and whatever had survived in the root cellar, something happened in the high hollows that families waited for all winter. Ramps came up. Wild leeks pushing through the last of the snow and dead leaves, their broad green leaves and white bulbs carrying a smell so strong, so pungently garlic and onion, that you could smell a patch of them from yards away before you ever saw them. Dug by the basketful, ramps were chopped and fried with eggs, the smell filling the cabin and clinging to clothes and hair for days afterward. A smell so distinctive that children showing up to school in April with ramps on their breath was simply expected, a known seasonal marker as reliable as the calendar itself. But ramps meant more than flavor. They were the first fresh green food after months without one. A literal nutritional and psychological turning point, the taste of winter actually ending. Today, ramp festivals draw crowds, and city restaurants serve ramp dishes for $24 a plate during their brief spring window, treating them as a delicacy. For families in these hollows, ramps were never a delicacy. They were relief, the smell of survival finally giving way to spring. Number 6. Gritted bread in late summer, when field corn was still too young to dry on the stalk, but had filled out enough to be useful. Families made gritted bread. Corn grated fresh off the cob, using a homemade grater, often just a flattened tin, punched full of holes and nailed to a board, the kernels scraped down into a rough, milky pulp. The sound of it was unmistakable, a steady, rhythmic scraping that carried through an open cabin door on an August evening, often done by whoever was too young or too old for heavier garden work, sitting on the porch with a bowl between their knees. That pulp, mixed with a little flour, salt, and a touch of sugar, was poured into a hot greased skillet and cooked like a thick pancake. The edges crisping while the inside stayed moist and slightly sweet, tasting unmistakably of fresh corn in a way dried cornmeal never quite matched. Gritted bread existed in a narrow window. Only a few weeks each year, when the corn was at exactly the right stage, and families who had lived through hard winters understood it as something almost like a celebration, a brief return of fresh-tasting food after a long stretch of stored and dried things. The scraping sound, repeated evening after evening for those few weeks, was the sound of late summer itself in these hollows. Number 5. Dried pumpkin and squash strips, hung from the rafters, alongside leather breeches and shuck beans. Another preservation method filled cabin rafters in the fall. Pumpkin and squash, peeled, sliced into long strips, and hung to dry near the chimney, where rising heat slowly drew the moisture out over several weeks, the strips curling and darkening from bright orange to a deep amber brown. By the time winter arrived, these strips had shrunk to a fraction of their original size, leathery and lightweight, taking up almost no storage space compared to the whole squash they'd come from, a critical advantage in a one-room cabin where every bit of space mattered. Rehydrated in water or milk, the strips swelled back up and could be mashed, sweetened with sorghum, and baked into pies, or simply simmered as a side dish alongside beans and cornbread. This was again preservation requiring no jars, no sugar in large quantities, no equipment beyond rafters and time. Just the same principle running through nearly every food in this video, the conversion of a perishable harvest into something that could wait patiently through months of cold for the moment it was needed. A pumpkin that would have rotted by November became pie filling in February. Nothing about that required electricity. It required only knowing how and the patience to wait. Number 4. Sassafras tea. In late winter, when colds and the general heaviness of months indoors set in, families dug sassafras roots, a small understory tree common throughout eastern Kentucky. Its roots carrying a distinctive reddish color and a smell instantly recognizable to anyone who grew up with it. Somewhere between root beer and cinnamon, warm and slightly sweet even before sugar was added. The roots were scrubbed, cut into pieces, and boiled, the water slowly turning a deep pinkish red, the smell filling the cabin in a way that felt almost medicinal and comforting at once. Sassafras tea was considered a blood thinner, a tonic for the sluggish feeling of deep winter, taken hot, sometimes with a little sorghum stirred in. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Sassafras root contains a compound called safrole, and in 1960, the FDA banned safrole as a food additive over cancer concerns identified in animal studies, effectively ending commercial sassafras tea and root beer flavored with real sassafras root. That's real regulatory history, and it's also why an entire category of homemade tonic simply vanished from store shelves within a generation. Not because families stopped wanting it, but because the ingredient itself was reclassified, and the knowledge of how to use it carefully, in moderation, the way it always had been, went with it. Number 3. Half-runner beans and streaked meat. The Sunday pot, 6 days a week, the bean pot held pintos, the everyday bean. But on Sunday, if the garden had produced well that year, half-runner beans went in instead. A different variety, flatter, with a slightly different texture and flavor that families considered special, almost ceremonial, even though to an outside eye they looked nearly identical to any other bean. What made Sunday different wasn't really the bean, though. It was the meat. Streaked meat, fatty, lean streaked bacon, costing about 8 cents a pound when it could be bought at all, went into the pot in a larger piece than during the week, visible chunks of it floating among the beans rather than just flavoring the broth from a small piece simmered and removed. For families who saw meat in small amounts most days, or some days not at all, Sunday dinner meant meat you could actually see and pick out with a fork, a visible marker that this day was different, even if the underlying meal was, structurally, the same beans and cornbread that had been eaten all week. That distinction mattered enormously. It was dignity, served in a bowl, the difference between a week that had been hard and a Sunday that, for one meal, looked a little like plenty. Number 2. Cathead biscuits with sorghum molasses stained for their size, large, irregular, roughly the size of a cat's head, with none of the dainty uniformity of a biscuit cutter. These biscuits were made by hand, torn off in rough portions from a mound of dough mixed with lard, buttermilk, and flour, then baked in a hot oven or skillet until the outsides turned deep golden brown and the insides stayed soft, almost fluffy. Despite their rough shape, a single cathead biscuit, split open while still hot enough to melt a pat of lard pressed into the center, was substantial, dense with fat and flour, built deliberately to carry a body through hours of hard morning work before the next meal. Sorghum molasses, dark and thick, poured slowly over a split biscuit, ran into every crack and crevice, the bitter-sweet flavor cutting through the richness of the lard. The caloric math here was simple and deliberate. Fat and flour in large quantities, eaten first thing in the morning before field work or a long walk through snow to a one-room schoolhouse. Today, bakeries in cities sell what they call biscuit bars, charging $6 for a single biscuit, roughly the size these were made by default, with a drizzle of honey standing in for sorghum. Grandma just called it breakfast. It was breakfast built like fuel, because that's exactly what it was. Number 1. Cushaw pie. The cushaw was a strange-looking squash, long, curved, pale green with darker stripes, more like something from a different climate entirely than a typical pumpkin. It grew easily in eastern Kentucky gardens, often without much tending at all, and by late fall, families had several sitting in the root cellar, waiting. Cushaw pie was the pie of these hollows, not pumpkin, never pumpkin, though to anyone tasting it for the first time the difference might seem subtle. The cushaw's flesh, baked down and mashed, had a slightly different texture, a little less stringy, and the pies made from it carried the same warm spice combination: cinnamon, nutmeg, a little ginger if it could be afforded, that filled a one-room cabin with a smell that meant something specific. It meant the year had been survived. The harvest was in. The hard months ahead had been prepared for, as much as they could be. A cushaw pie cooling on a windowsill in November was not just dessert. It was a marker, the closing of one cycle and the beginning of another, made from a squash that cost nothing, sweetened with what little sugar or sorghum could be spared and shared, usually among everyone in the house, because there was finally, briefly, something to share that wasn't strictly necessary. That is not a small thing. That is everything.